And Dr. Robert Kelly is an associate professor at the Department of Political Science and Diplomacy at Busan National University. He joins us live now from Busan in South Korea. Thanks so much for your time tonight. Firstly, you've been following the tensions on the Korean Peninsula for many years now, and these sanctions are among some of the toughest ever passed by the UN against North Korea. They're designed to stop Pyongyang's nuclear ambitions, but do you believe they'll succeed?
No, I don't. No, I don't. North Korea's got a pretty good record for going on 2 decades now, arguably longer. The North Korean program dates back arguably to the 60s and 70s. So the North Koreans have a good record over 2 decades of getting around sanctions. And now that they have the nuclear program, they're not going to get the nuclear weapons and the missiles. They're not going to give them up. I find that highly unlikely. What we can do is slow the program down, and that's what this really is designed to do. If we deprive them of the ability to move money around the international financial system, then it becomes harder for them to buy what they need overseas. But I doubt it will stop the program or roll it back. The hope, I think, is to freeze it where it is.
And the latest sanctions mean life will become even tougher for Kim Jong-un and the elite who support him. Can you give us a sense of what North Korea's leaders are trying to achieve by further alienating themselves from the international community, including from its traditional ally, China?
Sure. I think the North Koreans are taking a big risk with China, and there's been a lot of discussion about this over the last few years. If the Chinese cut the umbilical to North Korea really will go into a very serious crisis. I would argue probably a death spiral. I think it's China that really holds the key. But as to what are they trying to achieve, I think what they're really concerned about is a rerun of something like Iraq or Yugoslavia or Libya, right? We have an external force, the United States, basically, right? Push regime change and the collapse of the domestic regime. And then the old elite, they're on the run. They face, they face partisans. They're killed. Gaddafi met a grisly end on the street. Saddam Hussein, wound up before a court and he was hanged. I think this is really what the Kims are really afraid of, right? I mean, they're really worried that there will be actually an invasion, something like what happened in Iraq. This is what the North Koreans tell us, right? That the nuclear weapons are designed to prevent a repeat of Libya. And that's really the purpose of the program. And it's so important for them, this regime security, that they're willing to take the risk of alienating China.
Yes, but it is interesting that China, in the end, didn't stand in the way of punishing the North as it has done in the past. And we know Beijing has condemned the recent nuclear tests. Do you think China is looking to distance itself from the North?
Sure. I think there are two things going on in China's sort of ambivalent response on this. The first is that they really don't want the Americans ramping up in East Asia. Right? The Americans under President Obama have talked a lot about the pivot to Asia or the rebalance to Asia. And a lot of that is key to Chinese behavior. That is to say that the Chinese can rein in North Korea. There's really not a reason for the United States to flow forces into the region like missile defense. That's the one thing. I think the other thing, too, and this I don't think is really discussed much in the Western media, which is that the Chinese themselves, I think, are increasingly becoming uncomfortable with the amount of nuclear force that the North Koreans have. It's one thing for North Korea to have like 5 or 10 nuclear weapons of a basic sort of normal or early capability, right? I think what they're really worried about, I think what a lot of people are worried about, is that, in 10 or 20 years, the North Koreans are going to have hundreds of these weapons. They're going to have hundreds of missiles to put them on, and they might have a hydrogen bomb like they told us they had in January. I mean, that would make North Korea into a very substantial global nuclear power, which would be a real threat to the Chinese as well. They don't want North Korea to have these things any more than we do.
And another interesting aspect of the sanctions was that the United States and China worked closely together for many weeks to come up with the sanctions that both sides could pass. Is this a sign that perhaps China is trying to be more amenable to the West, including the United States?
Yes, I think so. I think the Chinese took a real beating in the global media in the last couple months over North Korea, right? You had 2 tests back to back. Both of these tests flagrantly, obviously, blatantly violate UN resolutions regarding North Korea, resolutions for which China has voted, to which China is technically legally obliged, right? And the North Koreans, they just run right by them, and they have for years now. And, to the extent that China has defended North Korea and prevented harsher sanctions, prevented the Kim family from being hauled before the International Criminal Court, to the extent that China is carrying North Korea's water, the Chinese take a lot of flack for this in the media. And they really have. The Western press has been relentless in identifying China as the primary, sort of problem in the last couple of months. And I think the Chinese are feeling the heat that they need to come around and at least do something, right? Because otherwise the alternative is, a big American buildup out here and missile defense and the rest, which they really don't want.
You mentioned at the beginning that you don't believe these latest sanctions, while they are the harshest that the UN has ever passed against North Korea, but you don't believe they'll work. What will it take to stop North Korea in its nuclear ambitions?
I should say, maybe I overspoke. I am relatively confident that the sanctions can, one, put a real dent in the lifestyle of the North Korean elite and force, some internal splits over how exactly to proceed. And second, I do think that if they are enforced, if China comes around, I do think they can freeze the program where they are. I think hopes to roll back the program, I think that's a little bit too much. Sort of going beyond this, I mean, it's really hard to know actually what we can do. I mean, the best we can do, like I said, in my sense, is just sort of freeze the program where it is. If you actually want to sort of get rid of the nuclear weapons, maybe we have to get the North Koreans back to the table. But they've rejected this. I mean, the Americans sort of on the sly suggested to the North Koreans some kind of discussion about nuclear weapons and a peace treaty back in late December, and the North Koreans just said no. I mean, they just don't seem that interested. So I'm not really sure what other possibilities there are. The use of force against North Korea, of course, would be hugely destabilizing. So my hope is freezing it where it is and then missile defense, to be honest, in South Korea and Japan.
And the UN sanctions, just briefly, Dr. Kelly, the UN sanctions were obviously the headline here, but South Korea also did something unprecedented, passing some legislation about North Korea's human rights abuses.
Yeah, this is true. I mean, South Korea has been sort of very split on how to deal with North Korea. Right, the sort of hawks, if you will, the sort of hardliners in response to North Korea are more often found in Washington than they are in Seoul. In South Korea, North Korea is often seen as sort of like this wayward brother and this kind of like this lost, sort of these lost ethnic kinsmen. And there's really a debate about how exactly to deal with North Korea. There's a hope that engagement will encourage North Korea to change. So Seoul is actually usually behind the United States when it comes to pushing hard for these things and going after the North Koreans over human rights stuff, which the North Koreans take very badly, is something the South has been very cautious about doing because they've always hoped engagement might work.
OK, Dr. Robert Kelly, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you again for your time tonight.
Thank you for having me.